Hello and welcome to the download. I'm your host, Dave Richardson, and it is time to spend a jobs report Friday with Canada's hardest working economist, Eric Lascelles. And Eric, I'm in Kamloops. You've been to Kamloops, right?
I have been to Kamloops, yes.
That's right.
I think I've done one work presentation there over the years, and was there once for pleasure as well.
Well, you've got a lot of fans here in Kamloops, and we are in our plaid shirts, our lumberjack shirts. Urban lumberjacks is more our thing. Although maybe I'll go down outside and chop some wood because this is a working man's report. More people go into work just like us. Most people work as hard as you, but you always have that little bit of an edge as the hardest working economist.
I just keep that
And
small edge.
yeah, that's small edge. Maybe not as a lumberjack, but as an economist, and that's what we're talking about. But bottom line is more jobs.
More
We wanted
jobs.
more jobs. We got more jobs.
I've missed all your
Canada
other
and the
hooks,
U.S.
but I can talk about that. Yeah, that's right. Canada and the U.S. both more jobs, which I mean is sort of the default assumption, right? Economies are usually growing and populations are usually rising and so on. So no shocks there. But actually, some above consensus job creation is maybe the main takeaway. So on the state side of things, 227,000 new jobs. That was a little bit above consensus. So it was above consensus, not a total shocker, but above consensus. The main thing, of course, to know is that this is the reversal of the presumably pandemically distorted hurricane distorted. I've got my wrong distortion, Dave.
Yeah, yeah,
The
yeah.
hurricane distortion data from October. So basically, the numbers were really weak in October. There had been 12,000 jobs created, nothing like the normal trend. That's, by the way, been revised up to 36,000, but still weak. But of course, we knew that was people just unable to get to the office and so on. And so we figured November would be strong. November is strong, up 227,000. Dave, do note we were flagging the upside risk for this, so we got that right. Doesn't always work that way, so I'll brag when I can. But yes, so it was some catch-up hiring plus some underlying, fundamental hiring assumed. I wouldn't say I'm, blown away by the number. I mean, yes, I guess at the end of the
Yeah.
day, it's above consensus. I feel like they could have managed more. I mean, I just keep thinking that for an economy that's chugging along and by all accounts growing at about 3% annualized, as it has now for two quarters in a row, and seemingly tracking something similar for the fourth quarter, I would have thought you could generate 150,000 jobs a month. And to the extent you didn't really get any in October, you wouldn't have blown my mind if it had been 300,000 or something. So
Yeah, yeah.
wouldn't say it was a crazy number, but nevertheless, did prove that the prior month was an anomaly. Does show that there's still hiring happening. Aggregate hours worked was up 0.4%. So again, not a shock that it's rising, but still that's a pretty good rate. If you wanted to poke a hole in it, I mean, one would just be, hey, this was catch-up hiring, and so it wasn't all totally legitimate. That's fair. The other hole would just be the unemployment rate did go a little higher. So it went from 4.1 to 4.2%. And that's kind of where we've been for a while now. It's been the 4 to 4.5% labor market. And I would still say this, to me, smacks of a soft landing in the sense that we are seeing unemployment rates that go up a tenth, they go down a tenth. The hiring numbers are loosely in line with what you'd expect or need to keep pace with the population. And so to me, this is about where you want to be. I think to the extent that we're, a little nervous about the next 6 months, it's probably a little nervous about, I hesitate to say too much hiring because, of course, hiring is good and workers are good and nobody wants to be unemployed. But with the stimulus coming and the animal spirit sort of revving up in the U.S. with a Trump win, all of which would seem to point to more economic growth. One concern is just could it be a bit too much and might there be some overheating? And so we didn't get that this time. This seems to be the classic soft landing. But we'll be watching closely. And so nervous about weak numbers, but also a little bit nervous about strong numbers, hoping for those
Yeah.
numbers in the middle. 100 and some thousand jobs a month is a good number.
Yeah, but this is kind of an important period because once you get to the point where the Fed starts cutting rates, they're usually cutting because they're worried about the potential for some softness in the economy, right? And I know this has been an unusual cycle when you do go back to COVID and many things that have happened, the government spending and the inflation, everything. But once the Fed starts cutting, the expectation is you start to see a little bit more hiring going on. You want to see that employment market strengthen, and this is, and again, like and always not too hot, not too cold. So you always like that little Goldilocks right in the middle, right, just right. And this almost kind of seems like it fell in that area, right?
I think so. Yep. I mean, I would say
Yeah.
this is very much in that range right now. I do wonder whether the trend rate, I guess I just said this, but I'll say it again. I do wonder whether the trend rate could even be a little bit higher in the coming months. And I mentioned that, and again, higher not than 227,000, but higher than, half of that you attribute to the prior month if things have been normal. And this is maybe consistent with a low 100,000s kind of for an individual month. I wonder if it could be a little bit higher just because you do keep in mind this is November. November was the election month. Really, what you're capturing is kind of mid-October to mid-November in terms of the reference months and when they're actually surveying people and picking up information. And so it wouldn't have been a complete shocker if some businesses did sit in their hands a little bit and said, let's just wait and see what the tax profile and what everything else is going to look and tariffs and everything else is going to look like over the next 4 years. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the number looked even a little better in the coming months. So that's one thought. On the rate cutting, yeah, I mean, it cuts many ways. Obviously, bottom line is that rate cuts help the economy, and so you would expect all else equal, more growth, not less. I would say though that the specific context here. Well, first of all, often the context in rate cuts, though, is, oh, something bad is happening and we're cutting rates. So it's not
That's
unusual
right.
to have rate cuts paired with sort of bad data. I would say this one is a bit different than that in that, to me, the rate cuts are this attempt and seemingly tentatively a successful attempt to manage this soft landing where you're kind of taking rates down at the same moment that the economy maybe might have otherwise lost some steam. And if you pull this off and get the balance just right, you end up with an economy that kind of keeps moving at a similar rate. So I guess I've just argued that rate cuts can equal fast growth, slow growth, or the same growth. And I guess that's, you just keep in mind the whole point here is that the monetary policy is meant to be this ballast that is providing an offset to whatever other forces are in the economy. So on that basis, it kind of looks like the rate cuts are coming off in a way that's keeping the economy alive. And we'll see whether there ends up being a bit of a deceleration or a bit of an acceleration. But for now, as you say, it's actually in the middle, and that's the porridge we're hoping to be eating, to use a Three Bears reference and to
Oh
confuse
yes,
everybody.
very much so.
Very
And
topical.
I have to watch for bears where I am right now. So you
Goodness.
probably don't down in downtown Toronto, but I do when I walk out of my room and head out to the airport here later today. It does it is starting to feel, and I think you've in reading some of your materials over the last couple, it is starting to feel like maybe the somewhat maligned Fed in different quarters may have actually nailed this. They may be engineering this soft landing that we all would love to see, and markets have kind of been signaling that over the last several months. Anyways, you're feeling, your odds of a soft landing are nudging up at this point.
Yeah, I mean, they've been rising really across 2024, just
Yes,
incrementally. I think the last official number we put on it was a 75% chance of a soft landing, which is pretty good, I
pretty
should
good.
say.
Yeah,
In my head, yeah, it's probably rising a little more. The no landing scenario, I'll admit, is maybe also growing a little bit, which is sort of the economy is a little too hot. So let's be careful
yeah,
what we wish for. But yeah, I think soft landing is still most likely. And again, someone asked me once, like, when will you say with certainty that we've achieved the soft landing? And it's a bit tricky in the sense that, of course, the risk of recession over the 12 months ahead is never zero, and so you're kind of left with
yeah,
this kind of
yes,
rolling. There's always something new, and I actually didn't
sure.
have a great answer for that question. I guess just celebrate that things are fine for now and they look pretty good, but no guarantees, forevermore into the future. But I will say, I mean, historically, it's really hard to pull off a soft landing given the environment that we've
Yeah,
been in. Every other time in modern history, dating right through the 60s and 70s, that there was an inflation spike of 5 percentage points or more, there was a recession like every other time, and seemingly
yeah,
that's been avoided. And we're now, I think, far enough removed from the inflation shock that the risk of that is shrinking. And you know as well as I do, kind of historically, when a central bank, when the Fed specifically is engaging in a tightening cycle, you do end up in a recession. 70, 80% of the time, you sort of debate some of the
yeah.
definitions and so on. But, most of the time, those things end badly. But this one, and we're now, wouldn't say out of the window of the risk of recession from an earlier tightening cycle, but we're moving beyond, as we've said now for several quarters, beyond certainly the period of maximum risk, and economy seems to be just fine. And so I would say that it does really look like a soft landing is likely. And again, if that sounds just like a ordinary run-of-the-mill comment. Just keep in mind actually how unusual that is to pull off
Yeah,
given the
yeah.
circumstances over the last several years. So I guess they do deserve some tentative credit, and we should probably talk about them in the context of this job number, which is
Well, that
there's a
was
decision.
Eric, as usual, you're anticipating all of my questions. Sometimes you just flow into answering my next It's this telepathic thing we've created over the years doing these podcasts together. But does this, the Fed's up in what, a week and a half,
Mm-hmm.
and does this change the decision? I mean, I think markets are expecting a percent cut, but does this make it, maybe they even pause, or is this, it looks like they're on the right track, so stay with the program, do your 25 basis point cut, and then let's see what happens next.
I mean, even setting aside the economic data, the lesson is usually if the market's got like a 60 or 70 or higher percent chance of something, you sort of go with it. Not just because probabilistically that's the outcome, but because actually it's been vanishingly rare for the Fed not to go with, the strong expectation and, desire not to surprise markets. Probably the more credible answer is because they've guided the markets to where they'd like the markets to be. And, you'd get a couple more speeches if they were planning on pausing and the market expected a cut. So it looks like a cut is fairly likely. I will say, and this is probably not that helpful, but I will say I do think the odds of a cut are a little bit lower than the market is pricing, if that makes sense. So it is still probably the best
Yeah,
guess. That's probably the only useful takeaway I can give here. But the job numbers look pretty solid, and the inflation numbers have been a little warmer, I think, than people would like to see. And I'm just reading a Fed Chair Powell quote here. The U.S. economy is in very good shape. There's no reason for that not to continue. The downside risks appear to be less in the labor market. He did say that before today's numbers, but I think it
yeah,
still holds
yeah,
up.
yeah,
Growth is definitely stronger than we thought. Inflation is coming a little higher. So the good news is we can afford to be a little more cautious as we try to find neutral. So when I read that, I think they could pause. Like that definitely
yeah,
is
yeah.
not inconsistent with a pause. So again, cut most likely, pause not impossible, maybe even a bit more likely than the market's pricing. I do think, though, maybe the more important point is, the urgency of cutting is down, which is precisely what Powell has just said. And so we're probably shifting to a not every meeting phase of this cutting cycle. And so, if they go in December, maybe they don't go in January. If they don't go in December, they probably still go in January. That wasn't the last rate cut in our view. And so it is shifting to that mode. I was trying to think, and again, the Fed has proven, quite profoundly in recent months that it's not holding back in the context of political uncertainty or holding back out of deference to political events, and so it's just doing what it thinks is necessary, and that's probably going to continue. In the back of my mind, I did think for a moment, I wonder if it makes sense to pause here and you cut on January. I think it's the 29th, late January, and Trump gets to claim victory, and suddenly the pressure on the Fed, is a little less. I'm not sure if there's a little tactical consideration there or not. Almost certainly not is the right answer. But let's assume
Yeah.
December, but they're still cutting. They're cutting fairly gradually. We do have a little bit more cutting actually than the market has priced in over the next year. And it's not our growth forecast. Our growth forecast, if anything, is a little above consensus. It's not the
Yeah,
inflation
yeah,
forecast. We did add a little bit to that in the context of prospective tariffs and faster growth under what we presume to be some of the Trump policies. It's kind of more a statement that we would have said that a neutral U.S. Fed funds rate going into the pandemic in the late 2010s was, 2.25%. That was the best guess. And we just kind of struggle a little bit with the idea that the new neutral 5 years later is twice as high. Like that's a real big
yeah,
change in
yeah,
what you think a normal rate is. And so you can certainly stack in scarring from the pandemic, and you can stack in, oops, maybe we had rates there too low in the 2010s in retrospect, and some deglobalization and some tariffs and a whole bunch of things. And I would still struggle to say, yeah, normal used to be 2 and now it's 4. I still think kind of a
yeah,
normal
yeah.
neutral rate is low or mid threes maybe or something. And so they may not get there immediately. And again, circumstances may not allow a neutral rate to be achieved in 2025. But I do think that that's not an unreasonable kind of target to think about over the next 18 months maybe.
Yeah, and again, we're going to see how this new presidency plays out, and what the whole set of policies is going to be. There's some that clearly people would view as somewhat inflationary, but there's others that if you look back to his previous term, we're not inflationary. Actually, we're anti-inflationary. So there's still a lot of uncertainty on the table, and that's why you, by the way, need to subscribe to this podcast. Here you go. The marketing's going to love this one. That was a very smooth lead in, Eric.
Oh yeah.
The You need to subscribe to the podcast. You can do that in anywhere you get your podcasts, and give us a 5-star review. My mom is getting tired of giving 5-star reviews, so she needs some support. She's she's on there every day, Eric. 5 stars. Another huge Eric Lascelles fan.
Right.
And like, how can he work so hard? I'm worried about him. That was her message to you.
Identical
But
twins. That's the answer.
yeah, oh really? Oh geez,
Oop, did I say that?
that is that. Oh yeah, yeah, that is pretty amazing. So the yeah, market reaction today is a little bit neutral. We'll look out on the Fed. For our Canadian listeners here, a little more interesting is we got a surprising little pop here in Canada.
Yes, we did. And so, again, with the usual, I mean, this caveat applies to the US as well, which is the numbers tend to be choppy and there are some pretty big standard errors
Yes,
around
yes,
them,
yeah,
but it is particularly true famously in Canada. So, yeah, 50,000 jobs. That's double the expectation. It's, as I look at it here, almost quadruple the prior month. So, those are exciting sounding numbers, though all very much within the margin for errors we've seen historically. But still, it was a good looking number from a hiring perspective. It was all full time hiring for what it's worth. And so, I guess you could
yeah,
describe those as quality jobs. I will say though that there were some kind of holes in this one. It was a weird report to be honest, and that's not unusual for the Canadian numbers. You probably shouldn't interpret too much unless you're looking at 6-month moving averages or 12-month moving averages and things like that. And I think the general story is one, in fact, on that basis in which hiring has slowed to some extent. But nevertheless, kind of the choppiness in this particular month was so total hours worked were down a little bit. So you had more workers,
mm,
somehow more full-time workers, and yet fewer hours worked. So I mean, go figure. It's always a bit of a frustrating exercise trying to construct one coherent narrative for these things. The unemployment rate did go up. So Canada's been buffeted by some really big immigration numbers and population growth, and so we've kind of known that you need a lot of hiring just to keep pace. And it's getting a little confusing again because we think that rate of population growth is slowing and a lot of the immigration programs have slowed and universities are sort of complaining that I should say probably more community colleges are complaining that their applicant pool has fallen by in some cases half. And so it would seem to me
yeah,
that we should be seeing some slowdown in the population numbers. But despite 50,000 new jobs, there was a larger increase in people looking for jobs, and so the unemployment rate did actually rise from 6.5 to 6.8%. And so you might recall this gets way back, I think, to late 2022, but the Canadian unemployment rate had been as low as 4.8%. So this is a 2 percentage point cumulative
yeah,
increase now. It's the highest number we've seen, in I guess 7 years or so since January
yeah, yeah,
2017. So not perfect on that basis. And it was kind of a weird report beneath the surface. You had like some sectors with giant gains and others with giant losses. I don't really know that it's worth even digging too deeply into it because I'm a little bit skeptical. But like wholesale retail was up 39,000, construction was up 18,000, which sounds promising if it's real. Professional, scientific, and technical was 17,000, education 15,000, accommodation, food services 15. Like those are big numbers. And if you added that
yeah,
up,
yeah,
Dave, and I'm sure you're as a human calculator, you were. What was the total? No, I'm just joking. It was a big number there. So there were big negatives too. So manufacturing lost 29,000, and transportation and warehousing lost 19,000. So kind of weird report, to be honest. And almost all the hiring was Alberta and Quebec. Kind of random too, not Ontario, BC. So I don't know. I guess this one, the
yeah.
headline looked pretty good. Beneath the surface, not quite as good. I guess it's okay, maybe, or even a little bit less
I
than okay would be
Eric,
my takeaway.
I did do the calculation.
Oh,
It came out to 50,000 net gain.
that is
Um,
incorrect, by the way.
I
In any event.
No, it's not. We gave the number, but anyways, so Canada, we as you mentioned, shifting policies on immigration. It's been a clearly Canada's the economy is not as strong as in the U.S.
Mhm.
Um, so we've got the Bank of Canada up next week, and we've got on the table as much as a 50 basis point cut. Starting to hear people more leaning towards a 25. Where do you think this sets the Bank of Canada up, especially after the other dynamic here is one of the things since the Trump election is we've seen a firming up in the U.S. dollar. I mean, the U.S.
Mhm.
dollar index is up about 5%. So that's all the basket of all the different currencies, but the Canadian dollar is down what, maybe a couple of percent
Mhm.
since election day. So that you've got a weaker Canadian. A lot of people talking about the Canadian dollar continuing to weaken. Where does this leave the Bank of Canada next week, in your opinion?
Yeah, so it is a tricky spot. I tend to think that the currency side, I mean, it's certainly relevant. And of course, a weaker currency has all
Yeah.
sorts of implications that if you're an investor and not currency hedged, I mean, it's a very real thing, of course, or a vacationer or any number of other economic actors. But I will say a couple percentage point decline doesn't, radically change the inflation or growth outlook in a way that makes the Bank of Canada have to, shelve rate cuts or suddenly double down. So I would say I don't feel like the move is enough to force a big move, but at the margin, it does argue you do a bit less rate cutting because you've had a bit of kind of equivalent help, you could say, from the currency, and so your competitiveness is a little bit higher, and you're in the position to import a little bit more inflation, and so on. Obviously, twisted against that is the idea that tariffs have been threatened, and bigger tariffs than anybody had sort of talked about on the campaign trail, even, which has perplexed everyone a bit, but nevertheless represent something of a threat, and we think it'll be negotiated away, and border controls and so on will be the solution. But nevertheless, that risk isn't zero. So there are all sorts of sort of, in fact, Canada's really in a very convoluted position right now. Like the economy, GDP was weak in the third quarter, 1% annualized growth, not great. U.S. moving at 3, like that's a big miss. Conversely, we've seen some, I would say, forward-looking business surveys getting a little better, like the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. It's like the NFIB in the U.S. Small Business Barometer. Their expectation just rose to its highest level since mid 2022, and the Business Outlook survey in Canada has been getting incrementally, I would say, less pessimistic in recent quarters. So you're kind of, it's a weak economy, people feeling a little better about it, which maybe makes sense given rate cuts. But then with these, tariff threats and immigration potentially falls out a bit unless it doesn't, depending on undocumented residents in the U.S. and what they
Yeah,
do.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
and productivity, we're kind of counting on reviving to hold everything together. And I think it's realistic to expect it to revive, but it is a bit of a wishful thinking. There's no guarantee that it does. So there are a lot of moving parts in Canada. There's a huge amount of uncertainty then in terms of the economy in the near term. The market has priced in one or two cuts for December 11th. That's the debate. U.S. is no cut or one cut, and Canada's one or two. Market is leaning toward two. And so again, kind of the rule of thumb is, unless you really want to be a hero, you probably shouldn't fight the market that's priced in like a 77% chance of, and I shouldn't say two cuts, of a 50 basis point cut is what I mean to say. And so I guess that's the most likely, but I will say, as with the US, I have a little bit of sympathy towards a slightly smaller cut, in the sense that if you got Canada chugging along at 50 basis point cuts, what happens if what is it, six days later, 7 days later, the U.S. doesn't cut, and suddenly, like, ooh,
Right.
that's a big gap.
Ooh.
I do wonder. I feel like if it was me running the central bank, maybe I'd do a 25, and just, we're still cutting, we're still moving, we've come a long way, we're now down to the mid threes, which is a pretty big distance. We can always do more later, and so that would be what I would think might be a bit more logical. But I'm, again, loath to be the hero and fight too hard against a market that's priced in quite a lot of cutting. And these job numbers are open to interpretation if you care more about the hiring or the unemployment rate and so on. I wouldn't say they are the final answer as to what the right decision is.
It is. I mean, you bring up that interesting dynamic that the Bank of Canada is a week ahead of the Fed,
Mm-hmm.
and just the flow of data out of the U.S., right? And we're all data dependent. Like I live my life based on data. I know you do too,
Mm.
right? The data out of the U.S. it opens the door, as we've been talking about on this podcast, to maybe not having to lower rates if you're the Federal Reserve, and that. So I can see, and even in your comment, the Bank of Canada's got to be sitting there going, well, are they? Aren't they? Can we go 50? Because that's kind of the expectation in the market. But maybe it's more sensible to go 25 and kind of hedge against it, and but maybe change the language in our release. Or but so it's a really interesting one because of the timing of the two,
Mm-hmm.
and the relative data flows within the two countries.
And market liquidity gets a little lighter. There's all sorts of other little,
Yeah, yeah.
small asides. I don't know. It's funny as you talk, I feel more and more sympathetic toward a 25, to be honest, in the sense that hey, you reclaim a little currency weakness and a few other things too. So we'll see what they bring. This is really an exercise. No model. We said this before. No model says that a 3.5% policy rate is genius and 3.75 is, or I guess we're talking 3.25 versus 3.5 is idiocy. This is when you're getting right down to individual decisions. Is reading the tea leaves, and so trying to get a sense of what will the Bank of Canada actually do. Neither one is a great or horrible move. They're pretty similar in the grand scheme, and so it is hard to say on that basis. I feel like maybe the 25 makes a bit more sense, but that's not where the market is.
Did you? I know you were in Minneapolis yesterday. Did you notice a difference at the border going across?
Oh, gee, that's a good question. I will say, yes, there was a feeling of optimism I detected. Now, I was in a room full of business people and finance types who are focusing on economic growth and all these sorts of things, and so
Yeah,
I'm sure I was missing a few perspectives in that.
sure.
But yes, I would say there was kind of a feeling of optimism that you see reflected in the stock market and elsewhere as well. I did, Dave. This is getting a little bit real. I did take an Uber ride, and somehow it came to light, and this just revealed this to me that I was riding with an undocumented resident, and I was
Oh,
asking him like, "What's the plan here?" And he was sort of saying, "Well, I'm going to stay if I can stay, and if I can't, I guess I'm headed back home." And so certainly there are other concerns and perspectives depending on the group that you
yeah.
talk with, of course. But overall, some optimism. I was in Minneapolis. I did get to tour the Minnesota Vikings Museum. There was an
Oh,
event sort of after the conference that was there, and that was pretty neat. They've got a good
that
team
that
this
that
year,
the
I'm told.
oh they very much do. I'm hoping for a big week from their quarterback in my fantasy football
Hmm.
league. But that's an aside. Did you get a McRib though, Eric, when
I
you were
did
there?
not. Were they available? I did not realize.
McRib is out. This is
Oh
the big thing.
no.
I'm headed actually right after I get off this call. I'm heading to a flight Kelowna or Kamloops, Vancouver, Vancouver, Chicago, Chicago, Indianapolis. Lots of McRib this weekend for me. I'm very excited about that and
Okay.
football. But it's
Wow.
I'm pretty excited and the other where I was actually going with that question. So you actually gave a much more interesting answer than I was looking for. But I was just wondering based on the sort of discussions around border security.
Oh,
Did you notice anything at the border in terms of the security, or were they just it's oh, that's Eric Lascelles, we just let him through?
right. Yeah, no, it certainly wasn't that. I can say that with precision. I do have a nexus, though. The Canadians know what that is,
Yeah,
which meant
yeah,
that it's a
yes,
pretty
yes.
smooth crossing. So no, nothing notable to report from the border on that front. I did not see drones flying overhead, nor are they usually flying within an airport, though. So in any event, but yeah, I mean, we should expect to see, I think, sterner border security and certainly all sorts of fascinating. If you read the news, and this is, I guess, more the Canadian news, there's been a lot of really fascinating reports coming out recently trying to quantify some of the indeed, undocumented flows across the
Yeah,
border
yeah.
that exist, and there are loopholes in Canada. Can't claim refugee status if you've already been in the U.S. is kind of the rule, and they closed the one big loophole in 2023. But there's this other one where if you sneak across and just are not found for 2 weeks, you still can, which seems like a pretty big loophole. And so that's one that seemingly is being being used. And I was even seeing estimates in the paper today about the cost that I guess the operations that are helping people move across the border illegally. The cost was it $6,000 and 40,000. Anyways, all sorts of information was coming to light. So we're going to learn a lot more about that, I think.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I guess the border is going to become a lot stiffer, though it is such a long border that one wonders the ability to actually pull that off.
Yeah, yeah. Well, hey, all of this entire discussion just leads up to 2025 is going to be a really interesting year. We're going to be watching closely. We're going to be watching closely with Eric Lascelles, Canada's hardest working economist. Eric, have a nice hard working weekend, and we'll catch up with you in the next couple of weeks.
Thanks, Dave. Bye, everybody.
This recording has been provided by RBC Global Asset Management, Inc. for informational purposes only and is not intended to be investment or financial advice. You should consult your own legal, accounting, tax, investment, or financial planning advisors before engaging in any transactions.